All right, let's switch gears and talk about some body changes more broadly. We're going to talk about muscle and fat and how the ratio of those changes, and then also bones. So muscle fat, when we talk about those changes in midlife, we often use the expression or term middle age spread. Maybe you've heard of this term before. This is something that applies both to men and women. And essentially, what it means is getting more fat in your middle section. So it's an increase in fat, a decrease in lean muscle broadly during this time, but there are some gender differences. So, for example, men on average, are developing fat on their back and then also their upper abdomen, whereas women, it's more around their waist and upper arms. There are clear signs from research that this change, this middle age spread, is not inevitable. This is something well established in the research that with diet and exercise, this middle age spread can be largely prevented. Now, that's, holding other factors such as physical illness or disability aside, right? But with a healthy diet and substantial exercise, usually they are talking about 30 minutes a day, or most days, then this middle age spread is not inevitable. This again, one of those things we can actually control. So there are lots of individual differences here. For bones, there are also individual differences. As a whole, when we look at mid-age, middle age, and then moving into, let's say, elderhood, bones are becoming more porous. And what happens when they're more porous is they're more prone to break. This is a loss in bone density. For women, this is especially problematic or more common, and it's starting even around the 40s for some women. The loss of bones and the porousness is, and the loss of bone density can lead to osteoporosis, but even if it doesn't lead to an official diagnosis, it still can cause problems. So one problem includes that the spinal discs can collapse, and you may have some elderly relatives who seem to have shrunk over time, or perhaps they were at some point, 5'7", and now they're 5'6", and you see here research shows that height drops by as much as 1 inch by age 60. So that's quite a substantial change. Just like gaining more fat instead of muscle, this is also really varied from person to person and also can be controlled to some extent by lifestyle changes. So things like diet for people who consume more calcium or vitamin D, there's research that suggests that this can help lessen the effects of bone loss. Maybe not completely prevent it, but lessen the negative side effects. Exercise and lifestyle choices are also things that could work towards lessening the effect of bone loss. You see, there's research that suggests that avoiding alcohol and cigarettes are also really good things to maintain a healthy body. So the changes suggested here with muscle and fat changes and changes to the bones are, this is not an exhaustive and full explanation of the biological changes that are taking place. This is a broad overview, and you see that there are gender differences between in both of these situations. And then lastly, that these are changes that are inevitable to some extent, but can be avoided depending on what someone chooses to do in terms of their overall lifestyle. Now I want to switch gears and talk about some body changes that have to do with the reproductive system. And I'm going to talk about men and women separately because there are some important differences between the reproductive system changes that occur in men and women. So for women, there's a period of about 10 years, although there's no normal timing or tempo similar to puberty. Similar to puberty, there are genes that mark the onset or like a predisposition for the onset of menopause. But environmental factors can influence whether those genes get turned on or not. So over this, again, roughly 10-year period, estrogen drops. And at the end of this period is menopause. So this is the end of menstruation and of reproductive capability. The onset age varies quite substantially from person to person, but there also are some important regional differences. So we see that usually in, let's say, the early 50s in US and parts of the Western world, but in other parts of the world that we see even earlier onset dates for menopause. So you see here in East Asia, there's some evidence that even until or as early as one's late 30s, menopause can begin. As I mentioned, there are environmental factors or lifestyle factors that could influence the onset of menopause. So there's research that suggests that women who are smokers often begin menopause earlier. And then there's also research that women who never have had a child begin menopause earlier. But these are just two of many different factors. So it's not as simple to say as if you have one of these, then this is when menopause is going to begin for you. So one of the things that happens during menopause and follows menopause is that estrogen levels decrease. And when estrogen levels are decreasing, this is causing many different physical effects. And so, in terms of women's reproductive system, we see reproductive organs shrinking. We also see that genitals are less stimulated than they once were, and the vagina is slower to lubricate. So, some women might struggle engaging in sexual intercourse, or even if it isn't that, it could still be uncomfortable. And you see the reports here that 35 to 40% report difficulties with sex. But it should be noted that I don't want you, A, to remember that specific range of percentages, but also B, that this number is likely to be a lot higher. And I say that because there are a lot of women who feel uncomfortable talking about the changes to their body, whether that's to friends, family, or doctors, or to a research survey. So I imagine that those numbers are even greater than the ones that are supplied here. There are other physical symptoms that go along with menopause, both before and after and during. So some women report emotional irritability. This is something in some ways that's similar to puberty, so moodiness. Not that everyone is experiencing it, but it is common enough to be a symptom. Some women report having hot flashes and or waking up sweating in the middle of the night, and there could be some sleep disturbances too. Um, One of the things I just wanted to tell a quick story about the hot flashes. One time I was taking a flight and there was a Southern woman who was the flight attendant, and she was probably in her 50s, and she was having a hot flash. But because she was a proper Southern woman and didn't want to call it a hot flash, she was talking to these women in front of me and said, "I'm having a moment. I'm having a moment." So essentially, she was experiencing this again, but didn't want to use those terms. There could be multiple reasons for that. So on the next slide, we're going to talk about some of the psychological reactions to menopause, because just like puberty, there are some people who go through puberty and have positive attitudes towards the changes that are happening in their body, and there are other people who have less positive attitudes towards those changes. Just like puberty, one's reactions to going through changes of menopause can be quite varied. So, for example, there are some women who might enter menopause or be going through menopause and view it as a traumatic time. Some of the reasons they may view it as sort of traumatic, and I don't use that word lightly. I mean, there's variations even in that word. But if, for example, they had life goals of having a family and it just didn't work out for them, menopause marks the end of reproductive capability, and so they're no longer able to have a biological child. So it could be traumatic. For women who really value youth and beauty and sex appeal, when we are going through menopause, some of these, we're aging, our bodies are changing. And so, like, if you are going from society's ideal, which it is largely in US culture, and going into an older body, this can be traumatic and hard to deal with, saying that I'm leaving my youth behind. However, for most women, menopause is really providing little or no trouble. It's not to say that they don't have symptoms, but in terms of their psychological attitudes, it's just seen as a normal part of aging. And for some women, there's even the chance to see this as a new beginning or an improved quality of life. In one way, they, for example, no longer have to worry about having a period. They don't have to worry about maybe getting accidentally pregnant if that's not something that they wanted, and or they're still engaging in sexual behaviors. So really, there's quite a bit of variation in reactions to menopause. One of the findings that has emerged is that those women who are highly educated tend to have more positive attitudes. The exact mechanism for this is not well understood, but I think part of it is going to come down to, this is my hypothesis at least, that just being informed that these are normal changes, that this is a normal part of aging, could lead someone to go into this time period just more informed. Like they know that what's happening and what's going on. We talked about this with puberty, both for well, we talked about it with females, but it also applies to males as well, that if you're more informed about the changes that are taking place in your body, the more likely it is that you go through that time period better. Lastly, I want to mention the role that culture plays. If you're in a culture that views menopause as like a syndrome, that there are symptoms, you already have this negative view of it. It's something that has to be treated or dealt with. So in much of the Western world, menopause is medicalized. Again, something that needs to be treated. And so that could affect how we view menopause because it's just seen as like something like an illness or a disease that you have to get through. If we compare it to some parts of the non-Western world in which being older or the aging process is viewed as growing into wisdom or having power within that particular culture. So in a given culture, if older women are respected, then we see that complaints about menopause are rare from within that community because it's seen as stepping into this just respected time, this time of wisdom, this time of power. In much of the Western world, it's not like that. We're moving from this ideal of beauty and youth to, in some ways, the elderly are thrown away or cast away. So we just have to always think of the role that culture plays in how we are viewing this time period.